You're taking us back to 1997, and then, as you said in that explanation, it wasn't until 2009 that there was actually some traction on the intersection between the conservation approach and carbon markets, right? And then you played this catalytic role in helping to define and develop the first methodologies, and then ultimately establish the first project, right? And then prove effectively that community-led conservation could be scaled and financed. Can you take us through those early days around the first methodology, the project implementation, and then ultimately that intersection and adoption by the market? Because I think that's a fascinating historical lesson that's oftentimes lost. There's a lot of vitriol and just a lot of people talk about REDD Plus as though they're subject matter experts and that everyone seems to have an opinion. But here we're faced with you, who is a subject matter expert and one of the pioneers who established this. Would love to unpack that with you.
Sure. I was unaware of climate, and of the climate of Kyoto when I started the work. And to say we were the first, just to be clear, it's always good to be the first at something globally, and even if you have to invent a category to be the first in. So we, as it turns out, we partly did that with Verra's, because there were attempts at protecting forests using market mechanisms or carbon as a math, and accounting for 30 years, right? Leading up, very few and none particularly successfully, but so what we were is the first project to get certified under the new Verra standard approach for that particular project type. That's what we were, first REDD Plus project under the Verra standard. Not even the first REDD Plus, actually, because TIST, I think, beat us to the post, or pipped us at the post, but TIST is a reforestation project. So the first avoided deforestation project is the category that we were first in. And that's really all we were interested in being. We just want to figure out how to find finance for standing forest, natural forest, and the wildlife that calls it home. The people used to come visit me in Kasagawa when we were trying to figure this out, and they would look at the 100,000 hectares, 200,000 acres, and they'd go, "What the hell why aren't you getting carbon credits?" So after Kyoto, and I would run to the library and read about it. Back in those days, we had to do that. There was no internet, or it wasn't so prevalent. I couldn't ask ChatGPT, how do I benefit from this? So every time I checked, it was like, no, not included, not included, not included. So, literally 10 years of funding this project with other kinds of activities, protection activities. Obviously, one thing, you have to figure out quickly in these projects is does the community need help in physically protecting the forest from outside parties? Not, if they're the threat themselves, then they can agree not to be the threat in order for the benefits of the project. But if they're not the threat, if the threat is external, which in many cases it is, then they need money and support to be able to protect their forest against those outside things. So this was the case in Kasagawa. They were partly the threat themselves because they were a slash and burn agricultural community, and they were eating into this corridor between two national parks. And we selected this particular location because it was a corridor between national parks that elephants used. And the conflict between elephants and people is intense in places like that because the people are subsisting. It's an intentional use of the word, on the crops that they can grow in an area where it's semi-arid to begin with. So they're lucky to get a good crop, and the elephants will come and eat it. Right before the elephants are smart enough to know exactly when they can come and eat it before the people are going to harvest it. And so you have this, and corn is a grass. It's a very attractive grass for elephants. It's like having a candy store outside the kindergarten. It's like so the elephants all come out and eat the corn and then go back into the national park. And so that was the experience of the community, really, of the elephants, is that they were the enemy. And so I knew that if we could figure out a solution that would turn that around in this location where, when I first went there, I was in these rooms of people just screaming at each other. Kenya Wildlife Service, that was responsible for the parks and protecting the elephants, is screaming at the community, and the community screaming at them because of this conflict. And so I thought, here's an intense place. If we can figure it out here, then it really has some merit. And it might be a model that we can replicate. So that's why there. The carbon thing, I was made aware of many times over the first 10 years, and it just never was an option really, because I didn't at that point think we could build a standard. I didn't really know what that was, to be honest. Verra's announcement in 2008 that they were going to support this as a standard was really the beginning of our real work to try and make this work. And we started out, we had the project, we started working with CCB first, because CCB existed previously to the VCS, as it was called then, for carbon. And so we hired a local forestry firm in California to help us go through this CCB. What kind of a monitoring forest measurement protocol do we need to have for field measurement? How do we teach these local communities to go measure this forest so that we can calculate carbon? So we really were going back. How do we do? We did destructive harvest. We had to kill a few trees to create curves for carbon content versus diameter of trees at breast height, because Kenya doesn't have a commercial forest species, so they hadn't been studied. Back in those days, very little had been done in terms of carbon quantification anyway. So we had to do all that work, our own alarmetry, and soil measurements of carbon, and we had to measure soil inside and outside the remaining forest to understand how quickly it degraded when farms came and tilled the soil for corn cultivation. So we did a lot of that work using just experts here in the US, because that expertise at that time did not exist in Kenya. The agricultural expertise did exist, and there was places where we could test for soil carbon. But we did all that work, and then we rated. We're like, we're like, okay, Vera, when's the methodology? Like, what's the methodology? And I don't know if you remember this thing, but there was a thing called Avoided Deforestation Partners, AD Partners, that was building the first, what they call now the modules. So the modules within the Vera system are, I can't forget what the number is, VM7 maybe, but the modules. Yep. And this group out of Washington, many of the people there are fantastic people, are good friends of mine now after all these years. But at that time, we were really looking for a way to do this project, and they were telling us they were going to be finished with this methodology for Vera, and they told me, 3 times it was going to be a month, and that period of time that passed in those 3 times was 6 months. And so I was like, well, you've told me 3 times now, you're a month from finishing, and it's 6 months from the first time you told me that. And so apparently you don't know when you're going to finish. And so I just thought, look, I can't be dependent on, an uncertain future. It's sort of the business impatience in me, was, all right, I need to hire somebody to write a methodology. So I went to Berkeley and found a scientist and hired him. He's still my chief technology officer today. And his job was write a methodology for this project. And the challenge, as I discovered later, which is still a challenge in the market, is that methodology was being developed to boil the ocean. It was intended to be a methodology that would support any project anywhere. And I just thought, wow, how's that even going to work? Everything's so different in all these different places. So we wrote, the first version of the methodology we wrote for Vera was avoided unplanned deforestation in dryland forest in southeastern Kenya. That was the methodology. So it was not, it really didn't have an ambition to be of use to anybody except us at that point. Because I was intentional, not because I didn't want a model that would be able to be moved, but because I knew that if we couldn't figure out how to write a very specific methodology that worked in this place, then I shouldn't try and figure out how to adapt it to lots of other places, tropical rainforest. So first version was that, dryland forest. Second version, later on, we adapted it to tropical wet rainforests when we went to the DRC, which is another story. But that's how it came about. I just got impatient with the process. And then at the end, of course, having invested for a year in developing, or 9 months in developing the methodology, the quote unquote modules came out a week before our methodology was approved. Would you believe it? So we weren't the first methodology. The modules came out a week before, but the modules had been working for 2.5 years. And we, I think, if I recall correctly, and we were able to get through the process because it was much narrower, our focus. So that's how we did it. we used that methodology for that project. It's been certified. It had, as you probably know from Vera's process, was that the methodologies had to be double validated by
Mhm.
external experts. So the methodology had to go through double validation by experts in the field, selected by Vera. The soil module had a soil scientist from, if I remember correctly, the University of Colorado or something that we had lots of conversations with about our soil module, and eventually got that through his approval. So it was quite at that days, it was really, there was no playbook. We were really making it up as we went along, to be honest. And I would say that even things like FPIC we had to make up, right? Because the concept of FPIC prior to the work that we do and other people in our space was designed by governments and by multilateral banks, where the C was consultation. So, and the whole concept previously had been, I'm coming to build a dam in your community, and I'm going to tell you about it before I show up with the bulldozers. Previous to that version of FPIC, they just used to show up with the bulldozers. And so FPIC was now a next step forward by governments and multilaterals to just basically have this consultation, but there was never a consent process. The community wasn't asked for their consent. They were just being told there's a mine going in over here, or there's a forestry project happening, or this, that, and the other. And
So just prior informed, not consent.
it was prior informed consultation. Like, we're consulting with you, but
Consultation.
we're not going to
Yeah.
do anything with what you tell us, basically.
Yeah.
The free prior informed consent, for us, it became very clear that if we were going to have a durable project on community land, because it was community land, then the community had to consent to that. Like, how is this not going to work without them consenting to it? We're not going to come in and just do it. So
Yeah, and it's not sustainable as well, right? Because you need to engage them as shareholders, stakeholders, essentially.
Totally. And which is very well understood now. I'll say, in all fairness, it's very well understood, and that field has evolved enormously in a positive way. There's still practitioners that don't necessarily do it well, but conceptually, it's much better than it was. But at those days, it was nascent. People didn't know what you're talking about when you said free prior informed consent. So why are you asking for consent? You're a business. Just do your project. The government said that to us. And we're like, well, but how can we do the project without the community? It's their land. So we had to sort of invent a consent process with the community, following their own governance. And so that's that. So lots of firsts, lots of things that since the beginning that we've had to be. But in the end, perseverance, because I still to this day, 30 years later, I don't think there's a better option. Like this is the best model for driving finance to these forest communities, and we'll keep pounding away at it and to make it work until there's a better option.